And so Jude's message is one of warning about the dangers of listening to false teaching on issues of spirituality, on issues of authority, on issues of sexuality, issues of where are the community boundaries, issues of fascination with the spirit realm, the spiritual realm, angels and whatnot. Okay, all of these are things that our own culture is dealing with right now.
Hello and welcome back to the Firebrand podcast. I'm Maggie Ulmer and I am here today with Dr. Scott Kisker, Dr. David Watson, and Dr. Jerome Van Kuiken. Jerome, it's so wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. For our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with you or don't know you, would you please introduce yourself for us?
Sure. I'm an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church, and I'm a professor of Christian thought at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and a dad and a missionary kid. So that's kind of, and a nerd. I have Lord of the Rings memorabilia in my office and stuff like that. I've written on theology and Spider-Man. So actually for Firebrand too.
Yeah, for Firebrand.
Sitting in the background what appears to be a full-size suit of armor.
That's right. That was a gift from my wife.
As for nerddom, if nothing else.
I'm excited about that. I mean, I can't really say that I'm a nerd, but I am a mother in a family of nerds, like my sons, my husband, like the Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, like It is strong in the Ulmer household.
Maggie, don't sell yourself short. You're very nerdy.
I just don't think I can fully roll with, like, when my husband and Luke, my middle son, get rolling on the nuances of the elven lore from Lord of the Rings. I'm like, all right, I'm out.
Yes.
I'm so out of my depth now.
It's its own particular brand of nerdy.
After Luke Skywalker.
Yeah. I'm just like, can we talk about Indiana Jones or a movie or I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, but, I have a son named Luke too, and I'm not saying he was named after Luke Skywalker, but I'm also not saying that didn't have any bearing on his name.
Yeah.
From my perspective.
All the characters, like, why isn't he Han?
Because you can't say, Han, I am your father.
Because my wife would not have gone for it. That's
right. Yes.
Yeah, well, I wanted to name a child Ansgar, also lost that battle with my wife.
Good thing.
And praise the Lord for it.
It's a cool name. He's a major saint who, like, missionized all the Northern Europeans.
He probably got beat up in school a lot, though.
Well, he got beat up by Vikings, if you wanted to be honest.
Wait, Jerome, are you named after Jerome?
Saint
The
Jerome.
Saint Jerome, yes?
Actually, not intentionally, but I'm sure claiming that. I'm living into it.
There you go.
At least parts of it. You know, Saint Jerome is kind of, he has two sides to him. You know, he's got the scholarship, biblical scholarship, and early church father thing going on. But then Thomas Merton one time rather accurately called him God's grouch. And so I'm trying not to live into that part of his heritage, his legacy.
I think we have enough grouchy theologians.
That's what we call Scott.
Not grouchy.
God's grouch.
All right. Well, we have gathered here on this auspicious occasion on Zoom to talk about Jerome's new book. Jerome, would you give us the title and just tell us all of the good, juicy stuff about it?
Okay. Well, the book is called The Judas We Never Knew. And the subtitle is A Study on the Life and Letter of Jude. So It's basically about the man and the book of Jude that we find in the Bible. And the reason that it's called The Judas We Never Knew is because in the Gospels, this is confusing for us as English readers, but in the Gospels, he's actually not called Jude, he's called Judas. Right. So he's one of several Judases that we encounter in the Gospels. And yet, when it comes to his letter at the back end of the New Testament, he gets called something different. He gets called Jude, in English, at least. And so that makes things confusing. But what I'm trying to do is introduce readers, and particularly folks in the church who may have always just sort of jumped over the book of Jude on their way to the book of Revelation, to pay attention to this little letter and to what we can learn about its author from the New Testament as well, from the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament. So reintroducing him to the church.
It's funny because you're right. It is such a short letter. It packs a major punch, but we get this famous line of scripture that is often repeated about the faith once delivered. And that is from the letter of Jude.
Yeah, that, and then the benediction at the end about to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and that sort of thing. The benediction, the beginning and the end of the book of Jude are about the only two things that anybody's ever heard from about Jude.
So why is it? Go ahead, David. What were you going to say?
Well, I said, is that in part because to understand Jude, you at least have to have some familiarity with some non-canonical literature, Jewish literature?
Yeah, I compare him in the book to Yoda. Because
Right.
he's short. The book of Jude is short.
Yeah.
It's strange.
Yeah.
It's really weird and kind of easy to ignore because just like Dagobah is off in the backwaters of the galaxy, Jude's off in the back of the Bible.
Oh my gosh, this is deep cuts right now.
Yeah, I know. Well, I don't think so. I don't think there's any.
Well, no, I mean, I am so excited that you just referenced Dagobah. I know that Jonathan Hanover is going to listen to this podcast and be like, my people, I feel seen.
Right. I mean, one thing about Jude is when I first became a Christian, and I didn't know anything about the Bible, but I wanted to kind of read it. And I wanted to make progress and feel like I was making progress. I started with like 3rd John and then 2nd John and then went to Jude. I was like doing it in order. So I could like, okay, check that one, in the front of the Bible, I would like check them off the list,
Right.
So, I mean, actually it had like a pretty major impact on my knowledge of what Christianity was, from the very beginning, so shortness is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to backtrack 1 second because David referenced these additional texts that we may or may not be familiar with referenced in Jude, namely the book of Enoch. And is there another one?
Testament of Moses or Assumption of Moses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and these are texts. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so, for example, in verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their own position but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains and deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. And so if you're reading this and you don't have like a good study Bible, you might read that and go, where in the heck did that come from? I don't quite remember reading that in the Old Testament, And so if you do have a good study Bible, or an academic study Bible, it will tell you, that this is a reference to 1st Enoch 6-19. But because Christian readers usually don't have familiarity with these, I think these sort of offhanded references that appear 2 or 3 places in the book of Jude can seem very opaque to readers and confusing.
Yeah. And so I address that in the book by talking about the issue of canonical boundaries. Why is some of this material not in the Bible and yet Jude is? And what are we to think of it? What are we to make of it? And how does Jude use it in his own context? And then what can we learn about that for how we're to engage our own context today? And so the references to popular culture that I make in the podcast, in my writings, in the book, are in some degree an attempt to follow the precedent that Jude sets.
That's awesome. And how would you, I'm cutting someone out. No.
I was attempting to speak, but go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott. Scott.
I don't want to take us, I don't want to like be the historian who like takes us off the trail, but we're talking about the text and we haven't talked about who is this guy.
That's right where I was going. So you go there.
That most Protestants have no idea who is behind the letter or book of Jude.
Right. And really, for about 4.5 centuries, there's been in the scholarly world this opinion that it's pseudonymous, that it's a late writing by somebody who claims the name of Jude but really isn't. And that idea goes all the way back to Martin Luther. He bequeathed that to Protestantism, the suspicion of the book of Jude. And for instance, in Luther's German Bible translation, he even puts a physical separation between the book of Jude and James and Revelation and Hebrews and the rest of the New Testament, and does some other things that physically, visibly exclude them from his preferred New Testament canon. And so Luther's bias there has carried over into scholarly circles, which means that Jude has pretty much been ignored, both the book and then also the man, because after all, if you think it's pseudonymous, then you're not going to connect the book with Judas, Jesus' sibling, from the Gospels.
I think one of the reasons that people attribute or regard Jude as pseudonymous, as in other words, not being written by the person it claims to have been written by, is that it's written in Greek. Same with James, right? And the Petrine books, they're written in Greek, and these are Palestinian Jews who we don't have any indication that they actually did speak Greek. And now, of course, these things could have been translated and that kind of thing. But that is something that sort of, I think, has given commentators pause.
Right.
On the other hand, so I'm using the HarperCollins Study Bible, and in the introduction to this, which is by Richard Bauckham, who's a very fine biblical scholar, he says the authenticity of the attribution to Jude has often been doubted, but recent work demonstrates that it is entirely plausible. This letter may therefore be one of the few New Testament writings to derive directly from Palestinian Jewish Christianity. We do not know to which churches it was originally written.
Right. And so since about 1970, the past several decades, there's been this sea change among scholars, New Testament scholars, who have begun to take the letter of Jude more seriously, who've begun to, and Richard Bauckham is an excellent example. He's really a pioneer of this shift that's taken place. And so they're beginning to think of it as an earlier writing, as actually having come from this relative of Jesus. And so what I'm trying to do is to bring that shift in scholarly opinion and bring it down into a popular level. So I'm not trying to break fresh ground, exegetically or anything like that, but mainly relying on Richard Bauckham and to some degree Ben Witherington. I'm trying to take their insights and present them to a popular audience in such a way as to reignite people's interest in the letter of Jude and in the man behind it.
Go ahead, Maggie. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So I was just, I'm just wondering what has sort of driven this project in terms of what do you feel like is the importance here for, all of Scripture is good for the edification and correction of human beings, but, what in particular about the letter of Jude is it that you feel like communicates perhaps something that we've we need or we've missed or.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are a few different answers to that. One is just because he's been neglected, he's been ignored for so long that we, right now in our culture, there's a real concern to pay attention to marginalized voices, right? And there's a concern for those who are excluded. There's a fascination in our culture with books that didn't make it into the Bible and lost Christianities and so forth. Well, here's somebody whose book did barely make it into the Bible, and yet he's been ignored ever since. And he presents us with a lost Christianity, Palestinian Jewish Christianity, that we need to pay attention to because it actually does challenge our cultural prejudices, our biases right now. And so Jude's message is one of warning about the dangers of listening to false teaching on issues of spirituality, on issues of authority, on issues of sexuality, issues of where are the community boundaries, issues of fascination with the spirit realm, the spiritual realm, angels and whatnot. Okay, all of these are things that our own culture is dealing with right now. And so not only is it just right and fair for us to listen to Jude because he's been ignored and marginalized for so long, but when we actually do listen to him, he has really relevant things to say to our day and time.
Do you, when in the famous line in verse 3, I find it necessary to write an appeal to you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to the saints. I love that line and I use it a lot. But if this is as early as you seem to think it is, and I don't doubt that, by the way, right? I'm not in any way contesting that claim. But if this is really early, do you have some sense of the content of that faith that Jude is referencing here, the one that is entrusted once and for all to the saints?
Yeah. Well, I would say that he's dealing with the same issue of passing on the faith and calling his congregations that he's writing to be true to that faith. It's the same kind of message that we find Paul giving to the Galatians and the Corinthian churches. And so the faith that he's calling them to be faithful to is essentially, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus of Nazareth? He is the Lord. He's the only master and Lord, as Jude describes him. And Jude has a really high Christology, right? Jesus is the only master and Lord, and he's set in parallel with God the Father in a way that, as Bauckham would say, places Jesus within the divine identity. And so there's a strong sense that the God of Israel has broken into history in the person of Jesus to bring salvation and restorative judgment for all.
Just like it is in Paul, I mean, it's the good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus and its eschatological implications. For, in this case, Palestinian Jewish believers.
Oh.
It definitely. Sorry, Scott, what'd you say?
So, which is the same thing it is for Paul.
Yeah, through a lot of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a very dominant idea that higher Christologies were later Christologies. In other words, the idea that Jesus is God or somehow divine is a later development. The more divine your Jesus, the later the development it is. But I think people like Bauckham and Larry Hurtado as well, have really challenged that idea quite successfully. That never really seemed plausible to me. But there's a lot of literature that sort of assumes that early on Jesus was regarded as something semi-divine or a wise teacher or particularly inspired or something like that. But over time, he became understood to be a godly figure And sort of the culmination of that is in the Nicene Creed or something like that. And, again, I think Jude gives the lie to that claim that that simply doesn't bear out unless you cook the books and you say that you say, well, because you reason circularly, basically, and say because Jude has a high Christology, it must be later.
Well, and I think this is interesting. We still haven't talked about exactly who is this Jude? What's his relationship to the apostles, to Jesus, to right? I mean, if Jude is, anyway, I'm going to let you talk about that, because at least some people who assume who Jude is, if Jude has a high Christology, that should make a big difference.
Right. Yeah. So, let's deal with his identity. He identifies himself in the opening to his letter as the brother of James, which is unusual enough. Usually, you would identify yourself as the son of so-and-so, not the brother of so-and-so. And then he identifies himself as the brother of James without clarifying which James. Well, in the early church, the James that could be spoken of simply as James, full stop, is James, who's known as the brother of the Lord. And so when we go back to the Gospels, we find this list of members of Jesus' household who are referred to as his brothers. And you find James, and then you also find Judas, which is the same name in Greek as Jude. And so it would appear that the author of the letter of Jude is identifying himself as that Judas who is part of Jesus' household, one of Jesus' close relatives, what the New Testament tends to refer to as the brothers of the Lord. Well, once you make that connection, then you can mine the data from the Gospels and even from the beginning of the book of Acts, and also from 1 Corinthians, where we find some things out about these brothers of the Lord. And one thing is that during Jesus' ministry, they don't particularly buy in to the claims that Jesus is making about himself. At one point, they think that he's lost his mind, and they try and pull him aside, take him away out of the public eye. The Gospel of John records another situation where they're actually trying to give Jesus career counseling. Well, if you're doing all these miracles, then why don't you go where the people actually are? Go to Jerusalem during a feast and show off, do some miracles. You can hear the same subtle temptation that the devil offers Jesus in the desert, right? Use your powers to show off, use them selfishly for your own gain. And so Jesus' brothers are not presented in a particularly positive light in the Gospels during his ministry. But then what you find is in the rest of the New Testament that they are believers now, and that they rise to leadership in the early church. And 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5 talks about how the brothers of the Lord travel around with their wives as itinerant evangelists. And we find James there as the de facto head of the church in Jerusalem. And so Jesus' resurrection clearly flipped the light switch for them from off to on and brought them to faith in Jesus, this brother of theirs, as the Messiah and as the divine Lord. And so that's the background that Jude or Judas brings with him to this letter.
This is sort of a tangent, but as I'm listening to, I'm also just enjoying the sort of prophetic, going back to the Old Testament, the echo of Joseph and his brothers. Mm-hmm. And
and of course the irony there is that Jude or Judas is a form of the name Judah. Yeah. Right. And so Judah was the one who kind of helped lead the conspiracy against Joseph, sold him off into slavery in Egypt. And then in the end, he's the one who, out of the brothers, who's most effective in trying to reconcile things.
Yeah, that's cool.
Think about the implication of that. Then when you read the letter of Jude, it can sound, one of the other reasons that people tend to shy away from it, is it can sound kind of scolding and negative. But if you keep in mind the background of who's writing it, Jude's letter, right towards the end, it ends with a call to mercy, to show mercy to those who doubt, who are debating, who are disputing about this. Snatch them from the fire. And think about who's writing this. Out of his own life experience, he's one who was a doubter, who was a disputer, who wasn't believing. And yet Jesus showed mercy to him and transformed his life. And so now he ends his letter calling for believers to show mercy to those who are on the outside, or who are duped by false teaching, or doubting, disputing themselves. And so, again, think about the implications of that for the wave of deconstruction of one's faith that's going on right now in our culture. And Jude has relevance, once again, for what we're dealing with right now, out of his own personal experience.
It is hard to explain why, not only why Jesus' brothers became his followers, and then their rise to prominence in the church apart from the resurrection, right? So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about the people that Jesus appeared to. And in verse 7, he says, then he appeared to James.
Oh.
And then he appeared to all the apostles. He appeared to his brother. Where's his brother been? You know, his brother has not been in the picture. His brother has not been on the team.
Mm-hmm.
And he appeared to him before he appeared to all the apostles. Mm-hmm. And then the next time we see James, he is the head of the Jerusalem church, and they're appealing to him in Acts 15. You know, so certainly the resurrection helps to account for the belief and the prominence of Jesus' brother James,
mm-hmm.
and by extension Jude in the early church. Judas. Jude.
We know from other external sources outside
mm-hmm.
the Bible, I mean, that first of all, that there were quite a number of relations of Jesus who were believers,
mm-hmm.
and that in the Jerusalem church, they always elected relations of Jesus to according to the flesh as leaders.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think the last bishop of Jerusalem, before
mm-hmm.
all, one is a great grandson of Jude.
Mm-hmm.
Judah Kyriakos, great grandson of Jude, the guy who we're talking about.
Right. And so one of my chapters in this book opens with, I've done a little historical fictional scenario of the description that Eusebius, the early church historian, gives us of Jude's grandsons being hauled in before Domitian, Emperor Domitian, and interrogated about whether they were trying to set up a kingdom, that sort of thing. So it was actually a fun little piece of writing to do research on that and then try and flesh it out in a historically plausible and interesting way.
Is it right? I'm just thinking about that. Is it right that Domitian wanted to kill off all the descendants of David, and then they pointed to the descendants of Jesus as descendants of David that we should just get rid of, or something like that? I'm trying to remember.
Right, and so he the way the story goes, the way Eusebius tells it, is that he hauls in a couple of Jude's grandsons, and they show him their hands. That their hands are calloused, that
they're workers.
They're manual laborers. They told him that they had a little plot of land up in Galilee that they farmed. And so when Domitian sees their hands, he despises them as basically country bumpkins and lets them go.
And don't they say something like, we have this plot of land that enables us to pay our taxes?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's, rent to Caesar.
Right.
Yeah.
Jerome, the letter of Jude is obviously extremely polemical. It takes aim at certain theological opponents and lets it rip. What do you think these folks are doing? What is the problem? Okay, like what issues is Jude really trying to address?
Right. Yeah. Jude talks about how they deny the lordship of Christ. They defame or slander or blaspheme angels, and then they're sexually immoral as well. And so you get the impression that, well, and not only just sexually immoral in the sense of, going out and having consensual sex, but that they're actually seducing members of the congregation. And so these are people who are setting themselves up as leaders, as teachers or prophets, but then they are abusing their power in ways that are financially and sexually and doctrinally exploitative. And so once again, you think about the kinds of things that have been making the news with Church Too and Me Too and that kind of thing, where you have people in power who are abusing their power for the sake of their own personal gain. And it's the same sort of scenario that Jude is dealing with.
Large church pastors.
Yeah. Globetrotting apologists.
Yep.
It's very common, isn't it, to see that? I mean, the problems we have today were not unknown to the biblical writers. And it seems like we keep repeating the same mistakes again and again.
Yeah. And that helps account as well for the colorful language that he uses, is because these folks the congregations that he's writing to are being scammed.
Yeah.
They're in danger of being scammed. And so he uses colorful language, just like today, you think about an ad on TV or a public service announcement might use really graphic imagery or some sort of colorful, memorable language. Jude is doing that in print without the advantage of having the kind of media resources that we do today.
Because false teaching is a serious matter, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, how things go in the Wesleyan Church. That's not my background. But I do know in a lot of mainline churches, there is kind of a commitment to pluralism.
Mhm.
And what that means is that it's very difficult to identify false teaching.
Right. Yeah.
But false teaching matters, right? Truth matters. Jesus is the very embodiment of truth.
Right.
And so Jude tells us from early on that you have to identify false teaching and hold false teachers accountable for their words. It doesn't mean they can't repent and come back. It doesn't mean, that we hate them or something like that, but false teaching really hurts people.
Yeah.
And it's not just in mainline. I mean,
Yeah,
honestly,
that's true. That's very true.
Evangelical American context is the only one I really know, is rife with bad teaching.
Yeah.
And the problem with bad teaching is that it enables those who receive it to misunderstand the nature of salvation and on what their salvation rests.
Yeah.
And thus they end up not saved in any real way, both from the guilt or power of sin in their lives. So, I mean, you end up having incredibly shallow Christians who have no root, and whenever anything difficult will come upon them or us, which it may soon, they will not stand in the through the fire.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really cool, for lack of a better word, is that you have written this book really for lay people, right? Is that correct?
Jerome, are you there?
I lost audio.
Oh, we can hear you.
Can
Okay.
you hear us now?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Maggie. I did not hear what
Oh,
you
that's
asked.
okay. That's absolutely fine. I was just saying that one of the things that I am sort of turning over and I'm grateful for in terms of the way you've written this book is that it's really written for the church at large, for laity.
Right. Yeah.
To engage. And so sometimes I think, for instance, if one is going to go on social media and sort of, do sort of your regular scroll through Twitter, now known as X. I know, how do people refer to Twitter now? I don't know. Or Facebook or whatever. It's not uncommon to come across pastors or church leaders who will sort of have a litany or a list of other pastors who you should not listen to, don't look at these people, they're terrible.
Yeah.
I saw that. I saw your Twitter feed this morning.
Someone was talking about Rick Warren as a progressive Christian.
Yes.
I'm like,
Yes.
Bubba, let me introduce you to some progressive Christians.
Yeah. Hello, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like people who want to say that Tim Keller is soft, progressive, anyway. So there's this type of just vitriol, hostility, and it's exhausting. And so I know for me, it's not, as I remember reading the letter of Jude and being sort of a child of the 90s and just being like, this is so harsh,
Right.
And but what I like about what it seems like you've set up here is you've unpacked all of the pieces and you've drawn a context around the strength, the motivation of the strength of his words, and really what's at stake here.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that just people in the church need. They know that a lot of faithful Christians know, hey, there are things inside the boundaries and there are things outside the boundaries, but it's really hard on the heart to be angry all the time,
Right. Yeah.
And so I appreciate that. I'm very appreciative of what it seems like you've drawn out here.
Yeah. Well, I definitely wanted to not just focus on the negative things that he does say, because he has a positive, rich doctrine of Jesus and even the Trinity in a nutshell, the beginnings of that. And he actually has a rich doctrine of the church as well. He has some beautiful imagery that he hints at of the church as being this temple of God. And if you think about, this was one of the things that I really enjoyed researching in preparation for this book, was looking into the temple that Jude would have known, right? The second temple, Herod's temple, that he would have gone on pilgrimage to year after year, and how big and how beautiful it was. And so for him to use this imagery of the church, the body of Christ, as being built up as a new temple, a spiritual temple, that has powerful aesthetic echoes to it as well. It's something beautiful. It's something exciting to be part of. And then Richard Baucham's point that really the highlight, the climax of the letter comes in his call to show mercy to others. It was an important piece of it as well for me. So the graphic language is there. And, going back to the 90s or whatever, do you remember, I don't know, this may even predate the 90s, but do you remember like the crash test dummies?
Yeah, sure.
Those commercials? Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you think about some of the colorful things that Jude has to say in Warning as being kind of like those crash test dummy public service announcements, right? We don't like people scolding us, but we sure go in for really powerful, emotionally gripping, sometimes even graphic visuals on TV or in movies, things like that. We don't have any problem with that, with apocalyptic imagery of the world getting blown up by, supervillain or a comet or whatever. And so if we think about, okay, Jude doesn't have access to film. So he's using the only way of communication that he has, and that is words on papyrus.
Mhm.
And so if we think of it more that way, then maybe that can help get us over the sense that, man, he's just an uptight skull.
Well,
Yeah.
and really, Jude is much more similar to what you might see, like religious tracts
Mhm.
as they existed certainly in the 18th century, right? They would have been a little more dense than they were when cartoons came along in the 70s, chick tracts. But it's kind of it's a powerful message aimed at the will,
Mhm.
and at repentance and conversion.
Yeah, and his brother talks that way too. I mean, you look at Jesus.
James and
I mean,
Jesus.
yeah, you children
All
of
the above.
vipers.
Mhm.
Not
Yeah.
all the time,
God.
but it is there.
Scott, did you just compare the letter of Jude to a chick tract?
Positively,
Yes. Yes,
as
you
in
did.
better than.
Go for it, Twitter.
I actually compared it tracts as they existed in the 18th century that folks like John Wesley, for example, might have written.
Twitter, don't go crazy, because I end up managing that account. I'm just not looking for that noise
Do it,
right
Twitter.
now. No.
Yeah.
All right.
It's the platform formerly known as Twitter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where
Right.
we call it now.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
It will
like
always be
Prince.
Twitter to me.
Also an old reference that probably
Yes.
it's just a total tangent here, but I saw a meme that referenced the Beastie Boys the other day, and it made me laugh. And so I showed it to someone who's basically half my age. I'm 45. This person is 20. And she goes, "Who are the Beastie Boys?"
Don't say that.
It's true. I'm
not listening to you, Maggie.
Okay. Well, on that note, and also I've reformed my musical tastes, I suppose. Still enjoy a little. Anyway, that has been our podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening. Jerome, thank you so much for being our guest. It has been a delightful conversation.
Well, thanks once again for having me. And I just want to underscore, since this is for the church, there are discussion questions at the end of each chapter. There's a video with bonus material that goes along with it. So this is really meant for the local church, for ordinary people who want to understand their New Testament better.
Yes, absolutely. And where can we find this wonderful resource?
Right. It is available at seedbed.com. www.seedbed.com. It's also available at Barnes & Noble and Amazon in ebook form.
Excellent. Well, you guys, make sure that you check that out. Let's have the title one more time, Jerome.
Yes, the Judas We Never Knew.
All right. You guys, make sure that you head on over to Seedbed or Amazon or barnesandnoble.com and pick up the Judas We Never Knew. And thank you again to Jerome. And that has been our podcast. Be sure to follow us on our social media channels, and we will come back to you in the next conversation.